the day Freddie Mercury met his childhood idol and cried. Freddie Mercury never cried in public, but when Aretha Franklin walked toward him backstage, the tears came and he couldn't stop them. What happened next was pure magic, a moment so profound that everyone who witnessed it described it as one of the most beautiful encounters in music history. This is the untold story of when rock's most theatrical performer met the voice he'd worshipped since childhood, and how that meeting revealed the vulnerable boy beneath the legend. April 1985, Detroit, Michigan. Queen was touring America, and Freddie Mercury was at the absolute peak of his confidence and fame. Just months earlier, they delivered the legendary Live Aid performance that cemented their status as one of the greatest live bands in history. Freddie was untouchable, invincible, the master of every stage he graced. But all of that confidence evaporated the moment someone told him Aretha Franklin was in the building. What happened over the next hour would become one of the most emotional experiences of Freddie's life, a meeting that connected him to his musical roots, his childhood dreams, and the fundamental reason he'd become a performer in the first place. This is the story of how a legend met his legend, and why sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we're stripped of all pretense and reduced to our truest selves. The lifelong worship. To understand the magnitude of this meeting, you have to understand what Aretha Franklin meant to Freddie Mercury. From the moment he first heard her voice as a teenager in the early 1960s, she became his North Star, the standard against which he measured all vocal performance, including his own. Friends from Freddie's art school days remember him playing Aretha's records obsessively. Respect. Think. You make me feel like a natural woman. He knew every note, every inflection, every breath. He'd analyze her phrasing for hours, trying to understand how she could convey so much emotion in a single sustained note. Freddie would say that Aretha taught him that technique without emotion is just gymnastics, Brian May recalled years later. He believed she had the most perfect voice in popular music, the power, the control, the soul. He'd get almost religious when talking about her singing. But Aretha represented more than just vocal excellence to Freddie. She embodied authenticity, the ability to be completely yourself while performing. She didn't hide behind theatrics or costumes. She simply stood and sang, and her voice alone was enough to command any room. For someone like Freddie, who relied so heavily on visual presentation, Aretha's pure vocal power was both inspiring and humbling. But what Freddie didn't know as he prepared for that 1985 Detroit show was that his childhood idol had been watching him too, and what she had to say would completely overwhelm him. The unexpected visitor. The day started normally enough. Queen was scheduled to perform at Joe Louis Arena, part of their Works tour. Sound check went smoothly, and Freddie was in good spirits, joking with the band and crew as he always did before a show. But around 5 p.m., about 2 hours before showtime, there was a commotion near the backstage entrance. Peter Freestone, Freddie's personal assistant, was the first to receive the news. Aretha Franklin had arrived at the venue and was asking if she could watch the show from the wings. She was in Detroit recording an album and had heard Queen was in town. As one of the city's most beloved residents, she had connections to get into any venue she wanted. Peter's immediate thought was how to tell Freddie without causing a complete meltdown. He knew about Freddie's decades-long worship of Aretha, and he worried that knowing she'd be watching might trigger such severe performance anxiety that it could affect the show. But there was no way to keep it secret. Word spread through the crew within minutes, and someone inevitably mentioned it within Freddie's earshot. The reaction was immediate and unprecedented. Freddie, who was usually unflappable before performances, went pale and had to sit down. "She's here? Aretha Franklin is actually here," he kept repeating, his voice shaking. "She's going to watch me perform? Oh God, I can't do this. I can't sing in front of her. What if she thinks I'm terrible?" Brian May tried to calm him down, pointing out the absurdity of Freddie Mercury, who had just conquered Live Aid, being nervous about performing. But Freddie was beyond rational thought. This wasn't just any audience member. This was the voice that had defined his understanding of what singing could be. The pre-show panic. For the next 90 minutes, Freddie experienced something his bandmates had never witnessed: genuine stage fright. He paced his dressing room, warmed up his voice obsessively, changed his outfit 3 times, and kept asking everyone if they thought his performance would be good enough. It was like watching someone regress to being a teenager, Roger Taylor remembered. All of Freddie's confidence just evaporated. He was genuinely terrified of disappointing her. At one point, Freddie asked if they could change the set list to include more vocally demanding songs, wanting to show Aretha the full range of his abilities. Brian had to gently point out that impressing Aretha Franklin wasn't worth risking vocal strain that might ruin the performance entirely. About 30 minutes before showtime, Peter Freestone brought news that made the situation even more intense. Aretha wanted to meet Freddie before the show. She was in a hospitality room backstage and had asked if he could stop by briefly before taking the stage. Freddie's response shocked everyone. "I can't. Tell her I'm too nervous. Tell her I'll meet her after the show, maybe. Oh God, what if she's disappointed in me? What if I'm not what she expected?" But here's what happened next that nobody could have predicted. Aretha Franklin wasn't willing to wait, and she decided to come to Freddie herself. The encounter. Freddie was in his dressing room, trying desperately to compose himself, when there was a knock on the door. Before anyone could respond, the door opened and Aretha Franklin walked in. Everything that happened next was burned into the memory of everyone present. Freddie stood up from his chair, and for several seconds, he simply stared. Here was the woman whose voice had shaped his entire understanding of music, whose records he'd played until they wore out, whose talent he'd revered for over 20 years. And she was standing in his dressing room, smiling at him. "Freddie Mercury," Aretha said, her voice carrying that unmistakable richness that had defined a generation of soul music. "I've been wanting to meet you for the longest time." That's when it happened. Freddie's eyes filled with tears, not theatrical tears or performative emotion, genuine, uncontrollable tears that started streaming down his face. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. He tried to compose himself, but couldn't. He just stood there, crying, unable to form words. Aretha's expression softened immediately. She understood what was happening. She'd seen it before from other artists who'd grown up worshiping her. She walked forward and pulled Freddie into a hug, which only made him cry harder. "It's okay, baby," she said softly. I know. Those simple words, "I know," acknowledged everything. She knew what her music had meant to him. She knew what this meeting represented. She knew that beneath all the costumes and confidence was a boy from Zanzibar who'd found his voice by listening to hers. The conversation. It took several minutes for Freddie to compose himself enough to speak. When he finally did, his voice was raw with emotion. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I promised myself I wouldn't cry. You've been everything to me since I was a teenager. Your voice taught me what singing should sound like." Aretha smiled. "That's sweet, honey. But you taught yourself. I've heard you sing. You've got something special, something completely your own." What followed was a 20-minute conversation that those present described as one of the most genuine exchanges they'd ever witnessed. All of Freddie's usual theatrical mannerisms disappeared. He wasn't Freddie Mercury the performer. He was Farrokh Bulsara the music fan, talking to his hero with an openness and vulnerability he rarely showed anyone. They talked about vocal technique, about the challenges of maintaining their voices while touring, about the emotional toll of always having to be on for audiences. Aretha shared stories about her early days in Detroit, about learning to sing in church, about the pressure of being called the Queen of Soul before she felt ready for that title. Freddie listened with an intensity that bordered on reverence, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just absorbing every word. At one point, he asked her about a specific phrase in Natural Woman, how she'd managed a particular transition that he'd been trying to replicate for years. Aretha laughed. "Baby, that wasn't technique. That was just feeling. I was thinking about something real when I sang that line, and it came out how it came out. That's the secret. Technique gets you started, but emotion takes you home." That statement would echo through Freddie's mind for the rest of his career. Technique gets you started, but emotion takes you home. It validated everything he'd been trying to achieve with his own performances. The theatrical presentation that allowed him to access genuine emotion. The visual spectacle that paradoxically made the music more authentic. The request. As their conversation continued, Aretha made a request that left Freddie speechless for the second time that evening. "I want to hear you sing something before the show," she said. "Just you and me in this room. Something that matters to you." Freddie's hands started shaking again. Singing for Aretha Franklin, without a band, without a crowd, without any of the armor he usually wore, it was the most terrifying thing he could imagine. but it was also an opportunity he couldn't refuse. "What should I sing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's in your heart right now," Aretha replied. After a moment's thought, Freddie began singing "Love of My Life," the Queen ballad he'd written for Mary Austin, a song that carried enormous personal meaning. His voice was gentle, vulnerable in a way it never was on stage. Without the power and showmanship he usually employed, his pure tone was exposed, along with all the emotion the song held for him. Aretha listened with her eyes closed, swaying slightly to the melody. When Freddie finished, there were tears in her eyes too. "That's beautiful," she said quietly. "That's real. Don't ever be afraid to sing like that, to let people hear your heart." Then she did something that became legendary in Queen circles. She began singing "Somebody to Love," the Queen song that Freddie had written as an homage to gospel music and, by extension, to Aretha's style. Hearing her voice those lyrics that he'd written was surreal for Freddie, like having his musical education come full circle. But Aretha didn't stop there. She gestured for Freddie to join her, and they sang together. "Somebody to Love" transformed into a duet between rock's most theatrical voice and soul's most authentic one. Their voices intertwined in ways that highlighted both their similarities and their differences, and what happened in that moment created magic that nobody who witnessed it would ever forget. The performance. When Freddie finally took the stage that night, something had fundamentally shifted. He performed with an emotional openness that was different from his usual theatrical confidence. The show was technically perfect as always, but there was an added layer of vulnerability that made it special. Brian May noticed it immediately. He was singing for her, May later explained. Every song was a gift to Aretha, a way of showing her what her influence had created. It was one of the most emotionally exposed performances I ever saw from Freddie. Aretha watched from the wings, smiling and sometimes singing along quietly. During Bohemian Rhapsody, when Freddie hit the powerful notes in the operatic section, she nodded in approval. During "We Are the Champions," she clapped along with the crowd, completely absorbed in the performance. After the show, Aretha came back to Freddie's dressing room. He was exhausted, drenched in sweat, but his face lit up when he saw her. "Was it okay?" he asked, suddenly insecure again. "Did you enjoy it?" "Baby," Aretha said, pulling him into another hug. "You're the real deal. Don't ever doubt that." The lasting impact. The meeting with Aretha Franklin had profound effects on Freddie's approach to performance and his understanding of his own artistry. In interviews following that night, he spoke more openly about the emotional foundation of his music, about the importance of genuine feeling beneath theatrical presentation. Friends noticed that Freddie referenced the encounter frequently, especially during moments of self-doubt. He'd say, "Aretha believed in me," as if that validation from his hero gave him permission to believe in himself, Mary Austin recalled. The meeting also seemed to help Freddie reconcile different aspects of his identity as a performer. Aretha had shown him that you could be technically brilliant and emotionally authentic simultaneously, that power and vulnerability weren't opposites but complements. Perhaps most significantly, the encounter reminded Freddie why he'd wanted to sing in the first place. Not for fame or success, but for the pure joy of musical expression and emotional connection. In an industry that often felt superficial and commercial, meeting Aretha had reconnected him to the fundamental human impulse that drives all great art: the gift. Several weeks after the Detroit meeting, Freddie sent Aretha a gift, a handwritten letter and a recording of their impromptu backstage duet that someone had captured on a cassette tape. The letter, which Aretha kept private until after Freddie's death, reportedly thanked her not just for her music, but for treating him with such kindness during a moment of vulnerability. In the letter, Freddie wrote about how much that meeting had meant to him, how it had reminded him why music mattered, and how her validation had healed something in him that he hadn't realized needed healing. He described feeling like a child again in the best possible way, full of wonder and possibility. Aretha's response was equally moving. She wrote back telling Freddie that meeting him had been a gift to her as well, that seeing her influence carried forward in such a unique and powerful way had reminded her why she sang. She told him that his courage in being so vulnerable was an inspiration, and that his music was already creating the same kind of impact on young singers that her music had created for his generation. The legacy. The story of Freddie meeting Aretha became part of music legend. though the details remained private until after both had passed away. Those who witnessed it were reluctant to speak about it during Freddie's lifetime, respecting the intensely personal nature of what they'd seen. When Freddie died in 1991, Aretha was among the artists who publicly mourned him. In her statement, she referenced their meeting, calling it one of the most beautiful moments of mutual respect and admiration she'd ever experienced. She said that Freddie had shown her that great artistry transcends genre, that soul isn't confined to any single style of music. Years later, when Aretha herself passed away in 2018, Brian May shared the story of that backstage meeting, describing it as a moment when two of history's greatest vocalists recognized themselves in each other. He talked about how Freddie had cried, how Aretha had comforted him, and how their duet had been one of the most magical musical moments he'd ever witnessed. The truth about heroes. The story of Freddie meeting Aretha reveals something profound about the nature of artistry and influence. Even the greatest performers are still fans at heart, still capable of being overwhelmed by the artists who inspired them. Freddie Mercury could command stadiums and dominate stages, but in the presence of Aretha Franklin, he became again the young boy listening to records in his bedroom, dreaming of making music that could touch people the way her music touched him. The encounter also shows that influence works in cycles. Aretha inspired Freddie, who would go on to inspire countless others, who would inspire the next generation. Great artists aren't isolated geniuses. They're links in an endless chain of creativity and inspiration, each one building on what came before while adding something uniquely their own. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this story is the kindness Aretha showed Freddie in his moment of vulnerability. She could have been distant or aloof, could have treated his tears as awkward or embarrassing. Instead, she embraced him literally and figuratively, validating his emotion and honoring the genuine love he had for her music. That's the beautiful story of when Freddie Mercury met his childhood idol and discovered that sometimes heroes live up to every expectation. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Mercury Moments family for more untold chapters from Queen's legendary frontman's life. Give this video a thumbs up if you've ever met someone who changed your life, and let us know in the comments about your own experiences meeting your heroes. Until next time, remember, the greatest artists never forget that they started as fans, and sometimes the most powerful moments come when we're vulnerable enough to show our true selves.